so to challenge them sitting outside, we know from experience how very difficult that is.
Mm. And that securitization space, I guess, is a critical space, particularly in the post 9/11 climate war on terror. One might argue, at least there is quite a bit of writing, I think of the work of Professor Deepa Kumar that argues how Islamophobia became the dominant way of thinking within security, intelligence, military infrastructures. And with that, then you would think that that became an entryway both for far right Zionist, white supremacist, Hindutva ideologues to be mainstreamed into these infrastructures because of the underlying Islamophobia that drives the broader lens through which you look at questions of security and terror and extremism. How do you start to undo, if you will, or decolonize that kind of colonial mindset that seems to particularly have been catalyzed through the war on terror, all the way into Trump and Muslim ban and sort of the kind of legitimization of Islamophobia as policy framework?
Oh, yeah, that's just a small question. So, like, let's remember that Islamophobia became the fuel for the war on terror. And so it became the reason to appropriate resources. I mean, when we even think of 3 trillion missing dollars in Iraq, let alone all the national treasures and everything else that was stolen and taken from that country. Afghanistan, Syria, so many other places that the war on terror, could only happen because they created an environment where it was possible to dehumanize and be suspicious of every Muslim, right? And we had reports that after the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks, that there were tens of thousands of Muslim men who just went missing in the US, whether they were deported, whether they were incarcerated, that the impacts were really significant. So you're fighting a military industrial complex and these defense contractors and really opaque corporations that are making huge amounts of money, way more than the whole drug trade by magnitudes, and killing people in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, as well as local actors. So the Council of American Islamic Relations, at least 10 years ago now or more, published a report showing how much money the Islamophobia industry was making from the likes of Daniel Pipes and so on. The challenge is huge. It's big. And that's just one sector. Again, I'm saying that Indigenous population, Maori, other communities have been suffering harm at similar levels in so many ways. So for me, it always goes back to how you fight power in any age, culture, space or time. It's through community. It's through interaction. It's through sharing of stories, building that understanding, trying to get people to see and understand what they didn't see before. In 2020, Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tahunu, we travelled to 46 towns and cities. We talked to every type of diverse person. We talked to a men's rights activist group. We talked to people who had previously been in prison, suffered from drug addictions. We talked to farming community. We talked to anyone, any different type of experience that we could. And now to be able to share some of those stories with people, and you sit there like I myself, through that experience, like I've lived in this country since 1972, I've grown up here, my education, as you say, I was involved in politics, so I moved around the community a lot, I've done a lot of not-for-profit governance, I feel like I've been around, but it was shocking and eye-opening, like through that process, what I felt most of all is that I did not know my country at all. That I had no idea that this is what some people are living with, this is what other people are dealing with, this is what life is like for them. There were beautiful things as well, there were some amazing things, but there was some real trauma and sadness in so many ways. And when I think if that was invisible to me, then for people who haven't had some of the experiences that I've had, it must be doubly invisible to them. So how do we share those experiences and talk to people and let them know? Because every time I've shared those stories, they've resonated, people have understood, it's opened their eyes, they've realised that they've only been seeing a little part of the picture, right? So it's that, and then it's mobilisation, and that's why that collective action and the collective voice of community is so critically important. And when we know that there are actors, and again I'm not going to name the groups, that are filling halls across the country with their racist rhetoric, and I ask the question of who is doing a bus tour to provide people with an alternative point of view, right? With a different picture and a different lens. I don't know where these groups are getting their money from. Again, it's so opaque, but how can they afford to spend full time doing these bus tours and being able to do these things? We need to be doing something that brings people together, and I think that is really, for me, the core of the mission of what we're doing at Inclusive Aotearoa is, you know, our vision statement of building a place where everyone feels that they can belong, you know, and it's very much that, is connecting communities, bringing people together, having those conversations, thinking about what action we can take, very much community based. And there's a space for, you know, fighting against, you know, or talking to government, trying to make government better, trying to make local government better, and, you know, full kudos to all the people that do that. I just am tired. I'm tired of that space, and I feel, for me, you know, when I said I'm sitting out this election, because for me, my hope really rests with community.
You know, and that really synergizes so much with the Copapa of Care in terms of, you know, what we talk about in our work is building voice infrastructures, spaces for listening to the voices within communities, and through that building spaces of dialogue where communities can lead that. And as I listen to you, you know, one of the things that I find so inspiring is this idea that communities are spaces of hope. They are spaces where we envision and nurture alternative rationalities, where we can challenge this misinformation and hate, you know, when people are empowered. I suppose the question is, you know, what you're doing with Inclusive Aotearoa, traveling across the country to do this, how can that be scaled and how can that be sustained so that more and more of these conversations can happen?
Yeah. It is. Yeah, I think that is a really good question, and it's critically important. The resourcing part of it is critical, because we are very deliberate with our design of the space and the skills that we take into that space. So you cannot just throw people in a room and expect them to be able to navigate these conversations. That doesn't happen. It doesn't work like that, because there's too much of a mismatch, there's too much misunderstanding, and the propensity or the the ability to hurt someone with your own ignorance or your own preconceived stereotypes is really high. And so therefore it's about how we create the space, how we invite people. Using whakawhanaungatanga has been a huge part of, creating the environment, because what I always say is the one thing that everyone is an expert is themselves, right? And if you start asking them to talk about themselves and their own story, and when you think of a very Western or Pākehā way of introducing is I did this and I studied that and I worked here and I worked there, and you get nothing about the person and their value base and who they are from that kind of introduction. Whereas when you start talking about their whakapapa, their connection to land, their connection to place, how things have felt for them, what their experiences are, what their stories are, and you get people talking about that, and they hear each other's stories because they have to sit and listen without questioning as each person does that introduction. The number of times that there are tears and vulnerability and that people have been able to be open, and many times when people have said to us, I've never shared that in a group before, or I've never said that to anyone before, because you create by design and you hold that space, and then to facilitate the discussion that comes after that, that people have left feeling uplifted and motivated and energized. That's a part of the work that we all really love. And I think our current project around bridging cultures, where we have marae host Pasifika and ethnic and Maori communities to talk about their experiences of discrimination and racism, have been some of our best work. And I really want to acknowledge my tangata whenua co-lead Gareth Jones here, who has led that project, and is an amazing treaty trainer as well. So that's been a huge part of the success of that program. But the whole team are great, and we use people that have really good facilitation experience, and still give them training before going into a space. And so for every different type of facilitation, whether it's our media group or so on, designing the run sheet, designing the questions to ask, thinking about, for us it was really critical, thinking about where the power in the room sits, making sure it sits with the participants to allow them to direct the conversation to some extent, but also making sure everyone gets equitable speaking time, all of those things. It's very much done with design and careful forethought. And I think it really is important to scale it, because that process of just sitting in the room, if we did nothing else but a whakawhanaungatanga, and very often when we review even our training and so on, and we ask people what was the thing that resonated most for them, whakawhanaungatanga has been often the top thing. Just that ability to hear other people's stories, and they've worked with this person for 15 years and never knew this about them, because those opportunities to share and to be able to be vulnerable in a space are so few and far between. And the way that we need to protect ourselves all the time. And some of us, particularly when you're facing multiple marginalisation, to be able to just relax and be yourself and let your guard down and actually share what life is like does not happen. And it's certainly not in a workplace setting often, and even in social settings. And maybe if they're lucky, they're family, but for some people, family is a hostile space. So, yeah, I think you're right that it is important to scale, and it is important that we just have that connection. And I won't even say that it has to be in person, face to face. We've run really successful conversations online on Zoom, equally powerful. So, yeah.
One thing I want to acknowledge here is the transformative power of um, Mataranga Maori, Kaupapa Maori knowledge systems here in Aotearoa. And we are so lucky to be in a space where we can learn from that. Um, as a communication scholar, I've found so much to learn about acts of communicating and forms of communicating from Kapapa Maori. And it seems like what you're articulating here is sort of that kind of opening that creates, that almost invites us to think of ourselves in new ways and relating to each other in new ways.
Absolutely. So, one of the papers that I sent you is one that's been supported by Trust Waikato around community blended finance models that are informed by both feminist and Indigenous perspectives, and it's a whole new way of doing economy, of running the economy, of running economic models. And as I read it, it was both familiar and new at the same time and mind-shattering. And I was like, but I knew this, but it wasn't put in that way and in such context for me before. But, it's values. It's a way of thinking, and a tribal culture compared to an individualist culture is it's a very different dynamic. So, yeah, I think it's really important for me, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago at a media hui, that honouring te tiriti isn't just about the way you tell stories in media. It's about how you organise, how your organisational structure looks like. It's about the values that they bring. And I said to them, it's also about how you sit with discomfort, how you allow yourself to be challenged, how you are prepared to shift and think differently. All of those things. And it's still a challenge for me, even with the best goodwill in the world and the really wanting to get it right. I still find that I'll rub up against ways of doing things because, for 30 years of my life I was an accountant. Now I accounted for every 6 minutes of my time, and everything had deadlines. You got to get your GST return filed on the date, or penalties. You've got to get your tax return filed. Like, everything was, and the rules were clear, and so the way that my brain works and my need for structure and so on is very different to the way that a lot of the world operates in Te Ao Māori, and so I still find myself feeling frustrated or, and just having to learn to take a step back or to chill out.
What does decolonizing accounting look like? Or how we account for organizational life, efficiency, effectiveness, and things
Absolutely.
like that.
What does our notions of time look like? Linear or circular or whatever? Like, there's so much to unpack around time, how we account for time, what it means to have a 50-minute counselling session as opposed to talking until the talking is done. All of those things, there's so much to unpack just in that one concept, and then you think about all the other values that we have.
One of the things, as we are speaking, Anjum, I also think as ethnic Tawiwi, and referring back to something Tina Nata says when she was here as an activist in residence, this idea of drawing upon indigenous culture, but also, thinking through what is our commitment then to supporting that political struggle, so that culture is not just an essence to extract from, but also as a site through which we participate in politics, hopefully to support policy making and governance structures that seek to live the imagination of Te Tiriti.
Yeah, I think one of the, benefits that I've had in my life is I grew up when the whole, I was in high school when the whole debates around the Springbok tour were happening. I was 14 when they came to Kirikiriroa and protesters stormed the field and all that happened after that. And I used to always, I don't know why, but I believe that you shouldn't mix politics and sport and you've got to keep it separate. Oh God, all this stuff, I don't know. I must have absorbed it from the media in the time or what, I don't know. And then a teacher of mine made me, we had a debate and she put me on the negative team where I had to take the position that this tour shouldn't happen. And then I learned about Bantustans and I learned about 80% of the population not being allowed to vote and all the other injustices of apartheid South Africa. And then I did fifth form history as it was then, seventh form history, and we had a teacher who was really good on the history of Aotearoa New Zealand and learning about the Maori land courts and all the different ways that Maori were dispossessed of their land, the raupatu, all of those things, right? And so when I think back to those teen years, for me, the vectors of injustice, South Africa, Palestine, Northern Ireland, and the Indigenous struggle here, those were the issues that were at the top of my mind. I think in terms of a tauiwi perspective on this, we're here in this country, therefore we have a responsibility, whether we contributed to the problem or not. If we aren't active in redressing and righting those injustices and bringing better equity, then we are continuing to contribute to the problem. We cannot sit back and say this has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, especially if we are benefiting from colonised structures. And so while I am marginalised in some ways, so through my Muslim identity, through wearing a hijab, being a woman of colour, I'm not marginalised in other ways. So socioeconomic, I've not had food poverty, I've not had to live in a car, I've not been hit for speaking my language at school, all of those things, there's this whole range of injustices that haven't happened to me. Does that mean that I should stop caring about them? If we're building a society, then the society here is built on a history. So we have a responsibility to familiarise ourselves with that history, to understand how it's impacting the present day and how those injustices are continuing to be perpetrated, and to keep advocating and standing alongside Māori to ensure that, that there is full redress, but that we change structures and institutions. And the interesting thing that we know about racism as well is that one of the reasons we did the Bridging Cultures Hui is because we also know that there's racism between those groups, Māori, Pacifica and ethnic communities. Many ethnic community people have a really derogatory view of tribal cultures and tribal ways of being. They're very much in that mindset of success being what you own and how much money you've made and how financially secure you are, rather than what you've done for other people or who you are as a person, right? And these are things, when I think of my birthplace of India, and the state of tribal cultures in that country, and how much we've imbued that individualistic thinking, and the only thing that protects us of that is a really strong extended family connection. So we feel that responsibility to our extended whānau, but generally not beyond that, not to other people's extended whānau.
Yeah,
and everything is so competitive to get into medical, to get into those administrative institutes and those kinds of things. For a few hundred places, there's tens of thousands of people applying, and success actually really, if you don't have financial stability and there's no social welfare system, it means poverty and possibly death. Death from heat, death from cold, death from starvation. So the risks are so high. So, you can understand how and why it is that they are like that. But is that necessarily the best way to be? And actually, the Indian socialist and communist spaces have been a lot stronger than they've ever been in Western spaces, and you see some really great things coming out of that as well. And it's a pity that the neoliberal project, from the 90s, 2000s have really taken over India, and the heavy level of protectionism and care that was around that economy has been dismantled step by step. And so again, those communal spaces and communal ways of thinking are so lost. And so then that is brought over to here, that mindset. And in the strong desire to protect our own culture, we forget that maybe there are other cultures we need to be learning from. And maybe we do need to let go of some of those traditions that we held to so strongly, because that is our identity here. That maybe we can let some go and take on new things. And so until you're ready and able to do that, how will you understand the struggles of our history and the work that we need to do? And so for me, things like Mātiki Mai and constitutional reform and moving away from the Westminster system are critical parts of that. And again, why I kind of am sitting out of politics, part of me is like, I don't want to participate in a system that's so broken and that doesn't deliver the results. And I've had first-hand experience of it not delivering the results that we need. That it is better to sort of step back and, as I said, focus on community, focus on sharing those stories, bringing people together and seeing if we can have that cultural change in community that will move to us doing politics and decision making better. Yeah.
There is so much to reflect on from what you're articulating, Anjum. And, I think of sort of my own privileges as a man born in a fairly middle caste family in a majoritarian context, being a Hindu, having economic access in a middle class family to education that enabled me mobility to navigate their resources, and then being in a heteronormative relationship within a patriarchal structure.
Able-bodied.
Yes.
All of those things.
Absolutely. And cis-normative, right?
Yeah.
And then thinking through how that relates to, some of the earliest work that I did as an academic was within the context of Adivasi or indigenous struggles in India. And one of the things that was most striking there was the confrontation, if you will, of worldviews. The worldview that I was educated into, sort of the pedagogy, and I went into the IITs, learned engineering, and so the notion of science for post-colonial development, what agriculture should be doing in communities, and then sort of being confronted with a very different worldview of the spirits residing in trees and forests needing to be safeguarded. And remember sort of the kind of intellectual, but I think also moral tensions that brought up in terms of what it means to be in this world and be uh, a student of science and engage in that conversation, you know. So now, when I think through what you're articulating within this context with migrant communities, and of course, not all migrant communities are similar, I think, speaking from Asian communities that have recently migrated, Indians. Who are largely upwardly mobile, of course, recognizing that there is a class of exploited Indian workers that migrate here as well and have very different kinds of access. But for an upwardly mobile Indian community, Tangata Whenua are projected systematically in that dominant structure as in negative stereotypes, if you will, right?
Absolutely.
So that becomes a rife space for narratives such as equality for all. So I saw this the really new AstroTurf advertising campaign. I don't know if you have seen it, that brings in different migrant communities that are articulating this narrative of equality for all. And what the subtext is that constitutional reform, Tetiriti, are sort of in the way of getting equality for all, right? So, how do you counter those discourses within migrant communities, also recognizing that the way the migrations structure is set up by the Crown right now, there is no Tetiriti education, right? So, migrants coming in quickly grab onto those prejudiced narratives and start reproducing these kinds of stories.
I mean, so, gosh, again, big question. So the immigration system itself is a racist construct. And I remember vividly when the Immigration Act was reviewed in 2008, going to select committee, writing submissions, ruining an expensive car because I hadn't checked the oil in the engine seat as I was driving back. But you know that Immigration New Zealand and immigration policy and law is exempt from the Human Rights Act. So they can discriminate in any way they like against any race, disability, whatever, and you cannot challenge them under the Human Rights Act or the Bill of Rights. Right? And the Human Rights Commission at that time, and we supported their submission to say you must have a human rights check. And if you need to discriminate, and there are times where you legitimately do need to discriminate, then it should be clearly articulated as to what you're discriminating and what is the basis for it. Of course, they don't want to do that. When the Public Service Legislation Bill went through Parliament a few years ago, it was certainly after the Christchurch mosque attacks, because we also submitted on that. And the Human Rights Commission again asked, and we supported, that Public Service Legislation Bill should have a requirement to comply with Human Rights Act. They didn't put it in. So these basic protections, human rights protections, are not being put into legislation. And so, of course, it's a hugely discriminatory process, hugely favouring privileged individuals. We measure human beings at cost. I've recently given comment to a group that's advocating against the discrimination against disabled people, which is similar to the way that they discriminate against our elders coming here, is that they can measure the health cost of those people to the last cent, but they cannot and do not measure the social benefit that these people bring. And they do not measure the intrinsic value of a human individual, regardless of whether they're contributing or not contributing in ways that you think contribution should happen. Right? So even that contributing and the definition of contribution is so laced within a particular worldview, right? And so, you know, that's the basis for people to come here. And then, as you say, they imbibe all these these views of Māori and Indigenous communities. And in our 2020 conversations, there were several people that said to us, we were told to stay away from Māori, that they're dangerous, that they're not safe. And then we met some and we wondered why we were told this. Well, what happens to the people that didn't meet some? Right? And, you know, we've talked about India. Another country that I'm a little bit familiar with is Malaysia. And, of course, the Malays are a sort of tribal indigenous population. You think about people in Hawaii and other Pacific islands. So we live in this world, and again, I'm going to blame capitalism for this, that unless you're working like 14, 15 hour days for 5 or 6 days a week, you're not a worthy individual. Whereas, you know, you have ways of being where it's like you only work enough. You don't have to work hard, you have to work enough. And you share the benefits of work. And so therefore, if your work is done for the day in 4 or 5 hours, it's done. Right? The crops are watered, the whatever, the infrastructure is looked after, and now you're out at the beach surfing or you're just relaxing. And the prevailing narrative about these types of ways of thinking is that they're lazy bludgers and they don't deserve to have nice things, they don't deserve anything. What do they expect? The way we devalue, you know, people that think, okay, we should work enough rather than we should work hard.
So the narrative of deservedness is a neoliberal
yes, exactly.
frame.
And that organisations are trying to get 1.5 to 2 people's work out of one person and treating it as a virtue that you're working all hours. And all of my friends in academia are working disgusting hours. Awful, awful hours. And I keep saying to them, well, why don't you just work to rule? Why don't you just work 40 hours a week? That's what you're contracted to do. Well, I wouldn't get the promotions. I wouldn't get it. I'll get demoted. I wouldn't get the opportunities. I wouldn't get to go to conferences. There's so many ways to punish people who are saying, like, you're paying me for this amount of work. That's the amount of work I'm giving you. I deserve a family life. I deserve weekends and holidays. And they're not, like, I'm seeing significant health issues because of overwork. How is that a virtue? Let alone young graduates going into accounting and legal firms and expecting to be at work by 7 a.m. and if they leave before 9, again, I'm like, why don't you just leave at 5 o'clock? Oh, well, then I won't get the permanent job. I won't get this and I won't get that. How is that healthy? It's not even productive. People stop being productive. It's not good. And so therefore, how can you then, living this really unhealthy, unproductive lifestyle, turn around and say to an indigenous population that they're lazy? Turn around and say to a tribal culture that they're bludgers or they expect everything handed to them on a plate. It's just a different way of being, and there's nothing wrong with it. And so, yeah, it's hard work shifting those mindsets. It is, because every TV program, movie, newspaper articles about upward mobility, everything is showing that success is the material goods you have, and success is working long, hard hours. I think that, you know, a Te Tiriti framework helps us to begin to unpack some of that. So aside from the justice, the redress, the historical inequities, the theft of land and resources, all of those things, it is actually, you know, better for us as people. Yeah.
One that supports our well-being.
Yes.
And sustains the earth and the ecosystem.
And when you have that engagement with Māori, they have something to learn from us too, and God knows they are. A lot of them are willing. Some of them aren't, because they also feel like, so this is what a patriarchal colonial system does. And we know it in India.
Divide and rule, right? It pits you against each other.
And so, yeah, so you see people who have very little look at us and feel anger and frustration, and that frustration is directed at us rather than the people that are upholding the system that allows it to happen and that it's not providing for them. It's very good at that. And so we hear that as well. It's like, you know, oh, Māori haven't even had this sorted. Why do you think you deserve it?
Yeah.
Well, because Pākehā have it. So why shouldn't we? And you should too. We always say we don't want our gains to be at the expense of Māori and Pacifica. We've always said, when I've been in so many Islamic Women's Council meetings and other meetings, and we're like, our gains should not be at the expense of. I've sat in meetings of a government department, this is quite a few years ago, where they've said, well, if we give you money, then we'll have to take it away from X Māori organisation. It's like, well, there's just no money there, and so then we'll have to take it away from them. What do you want us to tell them? Like, that's exactly how they're pitting us. You know, they never pointed the Pākehā dominant organisation and said we have to take money away from them, which would be like, good, they've had lots of money for lots of years. It's time to share. You know, no, they pit us against each other.
It's also, I suppose, in that sense, the compartmentalization and the ethnicization, if you will, in the sense that what gets hidden in that is that the infrastructure of the dominant organizations have been built to serve an overarching Pākehā population and established within those established ideologies of whiteness, if you will, that are prejudiced toward serving white populations in specific ways. And there is an ample research that documents this disparity, right? So when you culturalize and then you set up entities in opposition to each other, at the same time you sort of move the lens away from the whiteness of the dominant structure within which you're operating, isn't it?
And that then is used by extremists to say whiteness is under threat and it's all right to be white. And all of those, you know, so the pushback, it's from the extreme, but it resonates.
In the institutional structure.
It resonates because it's uncomfortable, but this is how we always do things. This is how things are structured. This is what, and our way is the right way, is that supremacist thinking of our way is the best way. There's no possible way that you could have knowledge or ways of doing or thinking that are better than our ways. And so, you know, for example, when you look at that pushback against Mātou Rangamāori and the letter to the listener and all that came out of that, you know, the real discomfort and being able to step back and say, hey, let's try something else. What does it taste like, feel like? What does it lead to? What will come out of it? No, automatically it's inferior. We mustn't. And that wall that is put up, I mean, our academic institutions are incredibly racist. Well, is this the point where I get to ask you questions?
Yes, absolutely, Anjum.
I don't even know what we're doing for time. I feel it's like hours.
Yeah, it's we have spent over an hour and a half, but you know, please do ask me questions, and then we wrap up when we do wrap up.
Yeah, okay, because nobody's listening to 2 hours.
Yeah.
But yeah, so my first question was around why you chose Islamophobia as a topic when you weren't Muslim. Why did that resonate with you, and how did you feel like this was something you wanted to focus on?
You know, we talk about how sort of our journeys, whether it is in our activism or as an academic, I can talk about my journey as an academic, is also tied to our personhood and sort of the ways in which we connect to our own histories, you know. So uh, I was born in post-colonial India in Bengal in 1970s. You know, this is sort of in the midst of the socialist turn in Bengal. Um, but you know, having come from a post-partition history, my mom's side of the family, they are Bengali Hindus who moved uh, to India post partition.
From West Bengal.
Yeah. And so that, you know, I grew up hearing a lot of stories of land dispossession, um, the pain that came along with that, but also hearing stories of interfaith harmony. How, for instance, you know, amidst that communal violence for my mom's family and for many Hindu neighbors, it were Muslim families in the village or in the community that offered sort of the protection and the safety, you know. So now juxtapose that to growing up, you know, for about 2 decades in Bengal, where there is sort of a deep commitment to a secular politics, there was a lot of syncretism that one saw around oneself. You know, this narrative of a secular constitutional commitment, a narrative that really took seriously this notion of pluralism. And in that sense, I think that you know, for those of us that grew up in 70s, this kind of a post-colonial commitment of the nation to an experiment in plural democracy was really what shaped sort of the journey, you know. And then in the personal familial context, you know, one of my uncles, he was film director, and he married someone who was a Muslim actress, you know. So in a very intimate setting, within the familial context, you had an interfaith a relationship, and you grew up witnessing that and what that meant, and you know, was seeing both of them living their faith traditions within the context of a relationship, and bringing up their child within that context, you know. So mid 1990s, this is when I'm graduating from um, college, is where I'm starting to see this India change dramatically, and almost like a 180 degrees switch. So in Bengal, you still have the left front government in place. So the whiff of sort of these communal um, uh, narratives um, are coming in, but are very limited. But there was the attack on the Babri Masjid, you know, which
I was
was
in India on that day.
where you. So that was the time, Anjum, when all of a sudden, and this was being televised on Doordarshan, the national television, and then there was curfew because of the communal tensions
We
everywhere.
had martial law. It was
Yeah.
more than curfew.
So we were in a training camp, you know, the NCC, the National Cadet Corps training camp. And we had to go in from the camp into the city to get the ration supplies. And I was on that team. And when coming back, the driver said you have to lay on the, because it was an open truck we were coming back on, you have to lay down, you can't lay your head up. So that sort of as a spectacle, it launched itself, Hindutva, if you will, with sort of this narrative of extreme hate. So, in some ways, I would say, Anshum, my interest in studying Islamophobia uh, sort of arose from an interest in understanding what is it that transformed my own faith, Hinduism, into this kind of a violent spectacle that became Hindutva, and really trying to grapple with it and not understanding or comprehending it. And then remember moving into the US as a graduate student, and within the Indian community, starting to see that division play out, and starting to speak back against it. Um, and then at that point, there were many student groups that would also resist and challenge Hindutva. I would say that it was fringe, you know. And then you fast forward 2 decades, and sort of the ideology of Hindutva has not only become hegemonic, but it has taken genocidal proportions. So, um, sort of that is the anchor that sustains my interest in studying Islamophobia, but more importantly, I think, in asking this question, what does it mean for India's Muslim minorities, who are one of the largest number of Muslims if you count in terms of the population size, and what does it mean for Indian democracy? And then going forward, um, how do you retain back this plural sense of democracy that is ensconced in the Indian constitution, and as one might say, as a post-colonial miracle story in democracy? And how do we turn to that?
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting, because I think, one of the things that I've always said is that the burden of solving discrimination shouldn't fall on the discriminated people, that it needs to come from the community that is most responsible for that discrimination. And that doesn't mean that the individual themselves are discriminating, but it is something that's happening within that community. But on the other hand, there's also the need for agency and voice of the discriminated people, right? And so that ties back to my earlier comments about racism in academia. And just one of the racist structures is that people of colour have been treated as objects to be studied and explained, right? And so you have Pākehā researchers coming into the community, explaining us, researching us, mining and extracting our knowledge and lived experience, building their careers on that, getting massive amounts of funding, sitting in all sorts of government working groups as experts on our experiences, while never promoting people from our communities, never getting some of that research funding into researchers from our communities. So given that you're kind of now sitting in that space of you're researching Islamophobia and you're researching, effectively something that impacts Muslim communities, how do you ensure that you're not perpetuating that same kind of racist structure that you happen to be working within?
What a beautiful question. What a poignant question. And I think, the thing that you point out, Anjum, first of all, is when studying Islamophobia, and I take Linda Tuhai Smith's invocation quite seriously, this question that knowledge historically has been extractive. So I'm also mindful of using the label studying, um, uh, recognizing that Islamophobia comes from my community. So part of that work then is challenging Hindutva, if you will, that I reside within. So that's sort of the first entry point, which means that rather than saying that I study Islamophobia, I'm much more invested in saying that I study Hindutva and its workings, because I know the community and its patterns and its majoritarianism, and how do I challenge it from their understanding sort of the infrastructures of othering. So this would be similar to the responsibility that falls upon white scholars to name the whiteness of the settler colonial project and to interrogate it. But also connected to that, then I think the ethos of the culture centered approach and the ethos of care, which is that how do we work on decolonizing registers that challenge this notion of knowledge being extractive, knowing that knowledge has historically been extractive. And I think the first point of that is to acknowledge that communities are owners of knowledge, they are vital owners of knowledge and need to be placed in spaces of decision making in ways in which we can support those decision making processes and to work as allies alongside placing our body on the line as allies. So that comes to the second concept, which is I think a key methodological ethos of the culture-centered approach is this idea of body on the line. So with these privileges, Anjum, as a Hindu from the majority community, how can I then speak out and articulate and voice and place my body in risk, knowing that I am fairly well protected in speaking and in articulating, while our Muslim community partners might have more challenges in articulating these. So, that the register has really been very helpful, like when writing our policy briefs or white papers, to really ask this question: can we listen? What does it mean to listen to voices of Muslim Fana, particularly at the intersectional margins? But then, how to draw upon one's privilege and the body to speak back and talk back to the structure. And then that brings to the third point, which is about the economics and the political economy of it. So, programs like this Activist in Residence program enables us to allocate resources and divert resources to acknowledge that activists or community partners are valuable resources whose knowledge generating capacities ought to be acknowledged, recognizing that's fairly limited. So that then brings us to the next level, which is that when we write grant applications or when we are writing up projects to try to design, you talked about your background in accounting, to try to design those resources in a way that most of those resources go into communities doing the work, and very limited coming to us as academics. And that actually has worked brilliantly with CARE, Anjum, in terms of our ability to support communities to drive the infrastructures, the materials, the funding that might support someone to do the work. The challenge is that we are continuing to operate within colonial spaces with colonial logic. So, FTEs are what are counted, right?
Yeah.
So, when I'm putting in, say, my FTE as a 0.05, then the question from the funder is that why do you have such little FTE? That means that you're going to give so little of your time. Of course, not recognizing that there is so much more time that you put in outside of what is conditioned into the FTE, but that you're doing that as a strategy, right? So I guess part of that work then is also doing this ongoing work of decolonizing how things are funded, moving them toward more progressive models that bring in these resources into the community. And I want to wrap up with the last point, and this relates to our violence prevention work. So, I think connecting with your work with Shama, you will find this really relevant. One of the things we saw while doing this ethnographic work is for many communities saying that so much of the community-led prevention work has become so professionalized that there is a professional managerial consulting class that is getting the resources and very little coming to communities, so for communities to drive the actual change work. So I think the continual challenge is for us to really be critically reflexive about how we can undo this neoliberal model of funding, which has itself established. I love this saying that the revolution will not be professionalized. That so that
Nice.
we move the solutions outside of these infrastructures into communities being able to lead that change.
Yeah. Which would really then begin to dismantle the ivory tower,
Yes.
which is critical. So you've talked about putting your body on the line, but how do you deal with, all of the hate and the various challenges, both to your professional status, to your job, to your personal reputation, and to the well-being of yourself and your family? How do you negotiate all those and still be able to show up every day?
I think, whānau is such a big part of sustenance of, I really am grateful to my family, that sort of has to negotiate much of the burdens, as for many of us doing this kind of activist work, often it's our families that get targeted as well and have to negotiate those tensions, those anxieties. Um, and family in a wider sense of the extended networks and connected with extended families of other families. Um, but also, I feel incredibly lucky to be supported by activists. One of the things I've found is that when you put your body on the line, and there are so many threats to your your personal life, there are others that show up from most unexpected spaces. And I thank you for your solidarity. And
No problem.
and there are so many civil society organizations and activists that have supported in this journey, so that I'm able to continue speaking up. And in that, I also want to point out, Anjum, something you articulated is in terms of the limits of the state structures and the crown structures. So where I've found net safe to be limited, the police security structure to be limited, there you have something like the Manaki Collective. And I want to put in a plug in here for the Manaki
They
Collective
are
and the
awesome.
awesome work that you do. And they reached out to me and said that, we can send you security equipment, or you can go to Noel Liming. They send me a site, you can get consultation and get the equipment, and then we can send you the putia. Let us know if you need people to come and support. So that is just so, um,
Yeah,
you know,
it's amazing.
and I think that teaches us what you were saying, this notion of how we can be in this world. So I think in some ways, Anjum, I also have been very lucky. Now, I think to discard the pain or to hide it would be disingenuous, because this has also meant that going to a temple, for instance, it's become, and as a Hindu, sometimes going to a temple is a space where you connect your faith with. And because you become marked, and there are things like, oh, we are going to extricate him from the temples, make sure that he can't come to the temples. You kind of feel like, okay, do I really bring my parents, my partner, my kids into a temple for them to be exposed to this? How do we navigate it? So those things have become quite difficult here in the diaspora. But then you also know that your faith is your relationship with God, and
That
no
can
one
happen
can,
anywhere.
and no one can deny you your faith, right?
That's right. It's like the world is a mosque, as we say. You can put your prayer mat anywhere. So for you as well, that's right. Those relationships can't be touched. They sit within us. Yeah. I think I know I had a few more questions, but I think we have talked quite
Yes,
a bit
we have.
around a lot of stuff. So I'll leave it there and just really want to thank you for your work and thank you for this opportunity to be here. I've been actually quite excited about it, and it's not too often that I can carve out a bit of time away from work and just say, no, bye team, I'm doing this. So I want to thank my team who are holding the space this week while I'm not there, and carrying everything, and to again thank my co-lead who's carrying that as well, the leadership journey there for a week.
And thank you so much for doing this, Anjum. We are so incredibly honored and grateful. And your voice offers so much courage to so many people that want to build or contribute toward inclusive spaces, and perhaps are struggling to find what is the way that you do it. So thank you for being that voice, and I'm really looking forward to working on our white paper around this complex issue of what does digital regulation look like, and how do we talk about and engage with digital platforms. Thank you. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Please do post your questions on any of the platforms, and we will come back to those questions as we work on our paper and hopefully find ways of addressing them.